Today we're going to talk about how to build out a plan in Cascade and also just the general planner feature within Cascade that allows you to see your strategic plans. So first and foremost, we're going to start by showing you where to go. Up here on the left, you see this planner. It's the very first icon that you have in Cascade. And you'll see all of the various plans that your instance has, which will only be one or two if you just started a new free trial. And you'll also have the ability to favorite various plans so that when you log in, you'll see the exact plan that you want to go to. Click into the plan that you'd like to edit. For this example, I'm going to do the 2021 corporate plan. And we're going to start by making sure that everyone's on the same page with the plan settings. We covered this in another video, so I'm not going to go through this here, but this is where we build out the structure, starting with, for example, our mission and vision, all the way down to the tangible parts of our strategy, like the objectives, projects, KPIs, or initiatives, or whatever you want this language to be. You can drag and drop these in to match exactly how your organization does strategy. Once you have that built out, you're going to want to go in and actually start to build your vision, values, focus areas, etc. You can do that by just simply clicking this edit icon. You can also just edit it directly in line here. But the edit icon, that pencil, gives you a little bit more ability to add, for example, an embedded video or text, change an icon, the color of the little bar, all that kind of stuff. So for this one, I have a nice little video where if I click this, it brings up that embedded video. And same with my values. If I click learn more, it gives me any text that I added there. Once I have this top part built, called the plan principles, I can collapse or expand this if I want a little bit more screen real estate to see the rest of my plan. On the left, you're going to see the focus areas. You usually will have 3 or 4 as a default, but you can add more just by clicking add focus area on the bottom left. It's going to bring up a modal similar to the vision and values where you can add in that information. And then same thing, you can click edit to see all of the details about an existing focus area and adjust them, or you can adjust it directly in line here. Once you have this built out, you're going to want to start building out your objectives, which we'll cover in just a second. Before we do that, it's important to note that you have a couple different ways of viewing this plan in Cascade. Not just on this planner page, but also within the Gantt view, which will default within a 90-day window here, looking at a quarterly basis. You can expand this out to show the full timeline for your plan with progress for each of these various things. And then even within this list view, I can change the way that this looks. I have the ability to click these 3 lines over here, which changes how I group. So for example, I can group these by, let's say I'm using the balanced scorecard, which will show you in the setup of the objectives in just a bit. It's going to reorganize these by the scorecard, or maybe I want to show it by owner. And the same thing over here, I can change this color by so that I maybe want to look by my focus areas since I'm not grouping by focus areas anymore. But you're always going to get the status as a lingering color on the left so that you can know at a glance what's on track or behind. I like to do goal template for the labels because it allows me to see when I'm building what that hierarchy actually looks like, make sure that I have the right structure in place, and then I usually default to just doing focus areas for my group by. Now we're going to dive into how to actually build objectives. Now that I have my vision, values, and focus areas defined, I'm going to want to go in and start to build out the various objectives, projects, and KPIs within my plan here to really bring it to life. First, we're going to start building out an objective, but before we even do that, I like to always make sure that my labels are showing me the goal template view, which allows me to see when I'm adding stuff if it's the correct template, such as an objective or under objective, KPI, or project. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to click add because I want to add a new objective. You'll see later on, if we want to add something under an objective, we have to expand it by clicking either over here on this arrow or in the blank space, as clicking on the text itself will open up our sidebar where we can edit it, but that's for another video. So I'm clicking add here to add an objective. And you're going to see Cascade automatically knows which template you should add based on what you selected in the strategy model. So for this one, I'm just going to call this sample objective 1. We can define our start and end date, which we generally recommend to build your objectives out to be the entire duration of the strategic plan that you're working on. So for this one, I'm just going to do the full fiscal year here. It'll default to you being the owner, although you can remove this for your top level objectives if you'd like. They don't have to have an owner. Everything below the objective or top level will have to have an owner, but we generally recommend having an owner in every layer in Cascade. You'll also notice that we have this Add New User button. This is one of several places in Cascade where you can add users. You'll also notice a button over here and in a couple other places. This is where on the fly, if you're building out objectives, you'll be able to invite a new user just by entering their email. You can also optionally put in some other information that's going to ask you about the person, but this will send them an invite where if they accept, it'll bring them into Cascade, and then also it'll allow you to select them as an owner. Moving on, we have 3 tabs here that we have to complete. The first is Define Details. Now, when we set up the strategy model, we told Cascade what we want there to be captured on an objective. For this example, we have a More Details optional field here, a weight, so I can say this is a top priority or secondary, and then the balanced scorecard. So for this one, I'm going to say this is a customer-facing element within my strategy. And then I can collapse Define Details. For tracking, we can skip this altogether for objectives. These objectives are going to default be tracked by the various goals underneath them. And Cascade knows that, so I don't have to go through and change that. And then same with alignment. I don't actually have to change the alignment because I added in context, so Cascade knows to put it right here underneath these other 3 objectives. I can either save it as a draft, which will allow me to then go on and delete it later without having to archive it first, or I can just launch it outright. I'm just going to choose to do that. Now I have my sample objective 1 launched, and I can start interacting with it. Now that we've built out our top level objective, we're going to want to go in and start to build out some of the stuff underneath it, such as our KPIs, projects, or whatever else you have in your strategy model underneath that top layer objective. For this example, I'm going to go in and I'm going to click in this blank space or in this little arrow here to expose a new add button that is underneath my objective. If I click add, it's going to bring up the same process as this objective, although you'll notice it's going to ask me right away for 2 options, either a KPI or a project. I'm going to select project because that's what we're going to build next, and then I'm going to change the name of the goal to sample project 1. Projects are the actions that we're working on, so we're probably going to put these due dates to be a little bit more specific to when we're actually going to do this. For this example, I'm going to say we started at the beginning of the month and we're going through maybe the end of September. Same thing, you're going to add an owner. Again, you can add as many co-owners as you'd like to this, and then you can switch this person to being an owner just by clicking on this little gray icon, which will then switch them to be the owner. Next, I'm going to go to Define Details. Again, when we set up the strategy model, we built out which details we have as options here. I'm just going to skip all those because none of those are mandatory. And then same thing as objectives for a tracking metric. I don't actually have to go in if I don't want to. It's going to default my projects to being a manually updated project, meaning I'll just come in and tell Cascade from 0 to 100%, where am I right now with completion? So I'm not going to change this at all because I want this to be manually updated. But one option for projects that is quite useful is you can track it by tasks. Once we have a project launched, we can add tasks to it so that as you tick off, say, 3 tasks of the 10, it will show us 30% complete. I'm going to leave this as manual slider, but I'll show you what that task completion looks like in our tracking video, which is coming later on in this course. Lastly, determine alignment. Again, not necessary because we're adding it directly in line. Although if this project does contribute to, for example, another objective or something in another plan, you can expand this section. It's already going to know where it currently lives, but you can add additional alignment and say, maybe this also lives within my marketing plan. And then Cascade's going to search for various objectives within your marketing plan or KPIs or wherever the strategy model would guide it in that specific plan. Same thing, I'm going to click either Save as Draft or Launch, In this case, I'm going to click launch. Don't ever be afraid by these buttons. You can always undo stuff. There's very few things you can do in Cascade that will break anything, so don't worry about that. I like to always just launch things right away so I can start working on them. Now that we have an objective and a project built out, the last thing I want to show is how to build something more quantitative. Whether you call this a metric or a KPI or whatever, it's going to follow the same thing where you actually have to define the tracking beyond just 0 to 100%. So it has a different setup a little bit than an objective or a project. I'm going to start with the same process, going under my objective here and clicking add. And this time I'm going to leave it on the selected KPI. And I'm going to call this sample KPI. Actually, I'm going to call this increase revenue, just so we have a slightly more realistic example. Notice I don't have to put the metric in the title because as I define the tracking, I'm going to tell Cascade what my metrics are. Same with the due date. I don't have to say to find my 2021 revenue, for example, because I can just build that in here and it's going to sort of bring together my start, due date, and tracking to create the name of the goal all in one line. So I'm going to go through and do the same process as before, define details. I don't have anything super specific. I'm going to change this to a lagging indicator. The rest of these things are optional. But most of my time is going to be spent in this tracking tab. So under tracking metric, I'm going to tell Cascade how I want to update this, first of all. Now, almost all your KPIs are going to be manually updated, which is also the setting you'll leave them on if you're going to integrate these with other software platforms. The only exception is if you have a sum of child goal, which will basically work exclusively if you have other KPIs underneath this metric that are adding up to equal this. So for example, if this revenue goal was for 5 years, I could have 5 individual year KPIs underneath it. And then this one could be tracked by the sum of each of those individual years, giving me my 5-year total. But for this example, I'm just going to stay with the manual slider. And I'm going to say I want to go from 0 to, let's say, 50,000. Keep it really simple. Next, I can select unit. I'm going to select dollars. If there are any units that you need to add here, you'll have to ask an admin if you're not an admin. Otherwise, if you go here underneath your name and go to customize fields, this is where you can add in additional units. So I'm going to go 0 to 50,000, and you're going to see that it's going to automatically give me these steps here. I'm going to want to click the advanced tracking options and go in and fill these out. I'm going to go through one of these at a time here. The first one is the tracking direction, and this is essentially going to stay at higher is better for this one and most of the ones you're going to track, but you might have a goal that's saying, for example, decrease lead to close time or something like that, in which case you want lower is better because you want your status to generally be below the dotted line. But for this one, we'll leave it there. And then next we have this option of target reached or target and due date reached. This is important to note if you want Cascade to only mark it as complete when you're at the end of your time period. This will be useful if you have something like, for example, employee satisfaction rating. Just because you're at 80%, which is your target, in June doesn't mean you actually completed the goal because that number might go down later in the year. So it's not going to show as complete until the year is over and you're above 80%. So for this one, let's just assume that revenue is not going to go down once it goes up. So we're going to leave it as just complete when the target is reached. Then we have the option of monthly, weekly, or quarterly updates. This is going to define the periods that we can actually go in and track individually beyond just the cumulative progress of this overall KPI. So for example, I can set this to be quarterly. So I'll have 4 periods, in which case I can see how I was doing beyond just the cumulative progress, which I'll always see as the status. You'll see more on that in just a bit. And then lastly, we have this option of steps or linear. As you can see right now, it's set to steps. Steps are a useful feature because it doesn't expect any progress until the end of the time period, in this case, quarters. This is good if you don't have a lot of data points coming in and you don't want Cascade to show as behind the entire time until you update it. What I mean by that is if I switch this to linear, you can see it's going to expect a tiny bit of progress every single day. So if you know you're not going to get an update until maybe the end of the month, you don't want Cascade to expect progress that entire month. in which case you'll use steps. Linear generally looks a little bit nicer, and if you're updating this more frequently, I would recommend linear. But otherwise, if you can set up steps to match how often you plan on updating this KPI, the actual status of on track behind will generally reflect more accurately. Lastly, we don't have to do anything for this define alignment unless you want it to live somewhere other than just underneath this objective. And then I'm going to click launch. So for this one, it's a little bit different than the others where we're going to want to expand this and take a look at this revenue goal. But before we do that, you can see, as I said earlier, it's built out in one line where it automatically pulls in my target and my due date. So that just showed you what I was saying earlier. But I'm going to expand this and I'm going to go to the tracking tab. This is where I can see those steps that I defined, those quarterly steps, and it's showing me as behind. Why is that? Well, it expected for the first step here, my first quarter, to be at about 1/4 of 50,000, which is about 12.3K. And in order to be ahead or on track, I need to have an actual of at least 12.3K. So when I move this up to 14, now I'm showing as green on track. Additionally, you can adjust all the things we built when we actually built the progress of this goal just by going edit expected progress. This is going to adjust that black line, which is your expected progress. I can switch it to linear. I can adjust by dragging what these timelines actually should be. So maybe I know my quarter one's going to be really slow, but we're really going to pick it up in Q2. Or I can adjust those over here and say, I need a more specific amount here of 30,000 by the end of, or by the beginning of July. So that's going to automatically kind of break these up. Lots you can do here. You can also switch this to monthly or weekly or whatever other time period you want to track these on. Ultimately, when you have this built out, it's going to give you a lot more clarity around why something is considered on track or behind.